Greetings, everyone. We have about 45 minutes of presentation today. So to keep us on track, I'm going to ask you to feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll address these at the end of our presentation. What we're discussing today by right-sizing your project manual is looking at the different factors that can affect how much information to include in your specification. For those of you who haven't joined me before, I'm Sherry, and I've spent the greater of 35 years as an independent specifier. Then over the last couple, I've dedicated time in launching an education arm of the company, specseducation.online. This website has educational videos that can quickly answer basic questions such as, what are three-part specs and what is master format? So you can understand why roof hatches are found in Division 8, for instance. I also provide individual and group training for teams to get them more comfortable using specifications because they do impact your project and teams need to understand them. I'm excited to share this conversation today with Eric Letbetter, and I'll let Eric introduce himself.
Thanks, Sherry. I'm a licensed architect with more than 30 years in the industry. I was working in a large nationally ranked design firm, leading projects where I was writing specifications for my own projects and taking those projects through construction, which means I was executing my own specifications in the field. But I was also writing specifications for other teams and projects in addition to managing the firm's master content. And I decided to start my own independent spec writing practice just back in August of last year.
So with Eric's experience, I knew he would be an asset to this conversation because as an independent for so long, I often hand off my project after CDs to the architectural team. So I appreciate Eric's having been able to enforce the specifications through construction and how that can add to this discussion on how much information to actually include in our specs. As we go through the session today, keep in mind that there's no single one answer for every project when it comes to deciding how much information to include. What you're going to see today is that there are a number of factors to take into consideration and a number of ways to handle them in your specification.
So we're not going to read through these, but we'll cover, on a sort of high level types of specifications, project delivery methods, specification methods, coordination between drawings and specifications, and then a little bit on navigating the specifications.
To keep our terminology and references clear, we're going to start by talking about the different types of specifications that we commonly see in the industry, starting with full-length specifications. So full-length specifications are just that. They are full three-part specifications. They're in master format order, in using the divisions and the numbering. They're very detailed. And I've used these for I would say 80 to 90% of the projects that I've written, but certainly for any project type and any delivery method for bidding and construction also.
So historically, I have used and advocated for full-length specs on almost all the projects in my professional life. Personally, I think it provides the best result and protection for most owners. But I think it also gives contractors the level of information that they need to enforce their subcontracts.
So short form specifications is just really diving into those details. When are they going to be, particularly, I guess I would say when the contractor's already on board. They're very concise. A lot of the extra stuff is gone. So once the contractor is on board, that's when I would use these for bidding and construction. They still follow three-part format, your part one, part two, part three. But I've also seen these where instead of part one, it's 1.1 general, and then A becomes summary, and 2.1 is materials, and then A is material, or 2.1 products, and then A becomes materials. So I've seen a couple different methods of using it, but essentially it's short, concise, and right to the point.
Yeah, I think the short form specs are good for particular for design development when you're hashing out basis of design or other sort of starting points, without getting bogged down in the details. I like to work with architects and sort of talk them through and get them starting to use part two as sort of their starting point for that. And the short form spec gives them a much narrower bit of text to look at. It's a lot less intimidating for younger designers that you're trying to bring up. Um, I did not use this approach frequently in the previous environment I was in, but now as an independent specifier, I'm seeing this preference for some more sophisticated design build specifications where the contractor has a much better idea of what they're using. They don't quite need the level of detail to enforce certain things because they're the contractor and the subcontractor. So outline specifications. I like to refer to outline specs as more of a commodity or performance based. Because you're going really very, very high level. You're not drilling down into too much detail in terms of products. Um, I have used this sort of structure, for lack of a better description, to set things up as an early basis of design using a specific type of product by name, especially with the industry trends to go chase early pricing and trying to establish a level of quality. We can sort of set that up with a specific product instead of trying to stick to all the details of the technical characteristics.
Yeah, I'm seeing this a lot more often now. It could be for those same reasons. Sometimes it's setting up those expectations for the owner. Um, if it's for pricing, oftentimes what we'll do is add a little bit more from part one, like submittals or field testing, if we're trying to get that pricing number. Um, but I am seeing these more often as an introduction, being used prior to starting construction specifications, or the full length specifications. For sheet specs, honestly, I'm asked about these so often that I'm currently working with an architect to develop a guide spec for their sheet specs, because they are so brief, they're highly condensed, and um, we're using these notes as protection, or we want to make sure that we're being protected by using these notes. So being too generic is not enough. Um, but sheet specs are included on as part of the drawing set. They're included on the sheets. They usually do follow master format as far as the division numbering. But I am also seeing this with negotiated work, where we know the contractor, they've worked with the architect or the owner a couple times, so they're familiar with the way that they operate.
Yeah, and I think it's a sheet specs become, if you use the formatting that Sherry had mentioned, it becomes a really good way to organize your drawing notes. So it's really a much more sophisticated way to develop and show your drawing notes if you're going to try to include all that information on the drawings. I see these used a lot more often on something that's either a repeat client or it's prototypical work. Um, it's still organized, in the way a CSI master format would be organized. Um, but a good use case for that would be, say, design build projects would be where I would start with that one.
So no specifications. This is much like sheet specs, only even less information and requires a whole lot of communication, right, between the parties of the contract. Um, I don't know how you, without specifications, how do you communicate those things such as how are submittals handled and are they even required at all? So no specifications. I don't condone this because otherwise I'd be out of a job.
The real set of questions that starts to talk about is what does this mean for your project? So either you're doing this intentionally, or maybe it's excluded. Maybe it's negotiate. Maybe you wrote them and included them, and they got negotiated out of the project between the contractor and the owner. So that owner contractor structure, it could play a significant role on how that's dealt with. Field testing is another thing on top of submittals that you sort of miss out on. How are pre-construction meetings handled? And in the case where those specs are excluded from the contractor, the design professional of record may have some sort of obligation to the state board to advise them in the case where they may not be performing construction phase services and the documents um, aren't part of the contract between the owner and the contractor.
So we've talked about terminology and around the specifications, and we realize that not all the specifications are equal, nor are they going to spell out the same amount of information. So let's move on to project delivery methods. So delivery methods are ways a project can be bid and billed. When I hear design, bid, build, I immediately think three products are equal, right? But that's not necessarily the case. CSI recognizes three types of design, bid, build. And the first two are competitive bid and competitive proposal. And the third type is negotiation. So this means that after the award of the bid, products may be selected proprietarily. Public agencies are required by law to obtain that best possible price, right? So design, bid, build, project delivery method requires that you know what that cost of the project is prior to signing the contract, which would typically fulfill a public agency obligation to, know what the price is before agreeing to work.
Yeah, so for design bid build, characteristics of competitive bidding mean that we're detailing the drawings to a high enough degree of detail to promote a fair and competitive bidding environment between the proposers so that the owners can get that best price. Competitive proposals are expected to take into account qualifications, experience, or even financial stability of the contractor. Uh, so what you might see included for a design bid build project is performance requirements, alternate manufacturers, often with the basis of design, and even some structured process to establish what counts as an equal to the basis of design, and how that is established and who makes that decision. Um, Delegated design should be clearly defined in this model so that the contractors can determine what's in that price. A particular note here is relationships. In design bid build, the architect or design professional is typically representing the owner. And then there's a similar project delivery method that maintains that spirit of competition is the use of a construction manager where the owner hires a professional person or a service company to manage the components of that process, including cost and time. This is particularly helpful if the owner does not have a construction expertise or background staff, either themselves to manage that effort. It's sort of beyond the scope of this discussion to go through the different types of CM roles, but briefly, from my experience, construction manager is typically a party outside of that owner's structure. They could be serving similarly as a either as an owner's rep, just acting on behalf of the owner with decision-making authority, or they could have some sort of financial risk based on the fiscal performance of the project. And I've noticed or noted that as a construction manager at risk or CMAR.
Hmm. Yeah, this method, design bid build, is primarily what I see. And some people say, oh, no, we don't use design bid build anymore. But they might be using some format of design bid build, but calling it something else. But this is primarily what I'm actually what majority of my projects are that I'm working on. What people say is the latest now is design build, but like I said, I think some of them are like the design bid build with that negotiation piece of it. But let's talk about design bid build. I'm sorry, design build. In the design build delivery method, the owner is contracting with one entity. The design build team becomes that one entity. So again, I do see this used for public works in that even though there may or may not be a competition even to they may have competition to select that design build team, and there's still competitive bidding among the subcontractors and the suppliers as well.
Yeah, I've seen some of these and worked under some of those some federal work or military base housing initiatives or proposals that were competitive pursuits based on the design build contracts. Construction is included with design as an arm underneath the contractor. And for some of those agencies, what they get out of it is a single source of responsibility for both design and construction. And so my experience was for that was mostly around NAVFAC or Navy projects. To that end, excuse me, this means the level of detail in the specs may vary. The design builder may suggest innovative approaches to the design and construction. They may even suggest products for consideration. Um, But because the architect does not represent the owner in this case, the level of responsibility that the spec would carry in traditional design bid build is not nearly as heavy. Unless it's a public entity that has a construction team reviewing design and construction documents. So in those cases, we may see that spec heavier with information as a more traditional design bid build.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing too, is when we're doing the design build, is I'm finding that the amount of information in the specification is equally as rigorous, if not sometimes more, depending on the entity. If it's for a public agency, they may have even more review and more scrutiny over the content. And so I'm almost seeing those being equal, if not more, in heavy in content. As we move to owner builder, now these are sophisticated owners with qualified staff, right? We're thinking real estate developer type, where they've got construction expertise on their staff, but they still contract with independent designers, architects, engineers, and also to also do the construction administration services. Because the owner has control of the contracts, there's likely, no criteria for low bid or pre-qualifications required through the specifications. So the specs may get slimmed down, and that's probably the slimmest that I've worked on is the this owner builder type contract where the contractors have that relationship with the contractors.
Yeah, other examples that I've seen include owner or brand standards. So a developer has a particular package or a particular design that they've got for one of their market rate apartment projects, for example. Or we see that in brand standards with hotel where, Marriott has their own brand standards that they like to deal with. So we can't typically change those. We may be given these standards to incorporate, the submittal or the installation requirements into the spec. But these are typically design standards that just can't be changed. Um, so in terms of packaging those up, they might be included at the end of a spec, sometimes as a separate volume or as an appendix, depending on the size of the project. And then depending on the scope, they might be rolled into the three-part CSI technical sections, where those owner requirements are then folded into the spec and then also part of the brand standards. Um, Often products are purchased under a national purchasing contract and therefore without substitutions. So while those impact the way we might traditionally use the Division One documents, we do still include those installation requirements for the product, even if the owners, knows what they're buying. An example of that might be, the brand standard has, tells you what all the stuff is. It's this kind of tile from these manufacturers, and the color might be on the drawings. And so the three-part spec for that would be, the Division One administrative part and then the execution part. But division, part two of that three-part may refer entirely to the brand standard.
So what we've learned so far is that the content that's included in your project manual can be dependent on the delivery method, which also impacts the type of specification that's required. And we also found that the relationship to the contractor can affect the selected delivery method, and thus, again, the amount of content to include. So let's consider the specification methods, because the methods do affect the amount of information included in the specification.
Yeah, so the short list: proprietary, performance, reference, and descriptive specs. Keep in mind that specifications are usually a combination of all these types. And rarely I have seen, a specification and see really, a project manual and see only one method written for the entire project.
And often I'll see a combination, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. I see the combination of some of them being used within individual specifications.
Yeah, and so, what we're trying to accomplish here is we're trying to specify what the owner wants very specifically. And these used where something is very clear about what is want and what is needed, and it's more often than not represents a one-way street.
As Eric mentioned, with proprietary, there's two ways to use proprietary. It can be open proprietary or closed proprietary, where open is or equal and allows equal substitutions, but then where the closed says nope, no substitutions, as one of these three products and no substitution.
Yeah, so the or equal discussion is it can go we could go really deep into that one. That could be its own separate discussion. But I think recognizing that's a much more in-depth discussion that warrants its own uh, separate idea or presentation. But I think the warning there is that you need a clear process for establishing or limiting those substitutions. And from what I've seen, the or equal clause from a lot of people is a little too open. It's a little too vague because it doesn't say who establishes what that equal is. So you need to be very clear about who and when and how those equals are established. Yeah, and so when we, move on to performance spec, we're really just trying to state what those desired results are without referring to a specific product. I think it's very common to use a performance specification for what I would call a commodities type spec, such as maybe concrete masonry or metal stud framing, or even windows where the predominant, criteria is really, structural envelope testing criteria that's governing the decision.
Yeah, so the a couple ways I've seen it is some of you might recognize on the left side of this image, that's uniformat. That's another method of specifying or a type of specification. That's, I've used this really early, like like schematic design or concept design, where we're just briefly describing, these are the basic results. This is what we want it to do. We want the roof to keep the water out, for example, just really brief. Or, we want the floor decks to be like this, that's highlighted in blue, steel decks with concrete topping. So it's just so vague, but describing what the overall performance is desired. And then the uniformat is often transferred over to the estimations. The estimators will use that to start guiding their costs. The image on the right is performance of windows, I believe. Yeah. So even if you have delegated design, you need to state what those performance requirements are that you want that delegated design item to meet. So that's another place that you can use the performance specifications.
Yeah, so when we get to a descriptive uh, process, we're not necessarily talking about performance, but we're probably talking about, a detailed description of a product without actually naming a product. So in this case, the example, it's a bentonite product, and we want a bentonite product, and so we want it to be made of that particular material, and we know that there are a number of manufacturers that could meet that, and we're not as necessarily concerned about the manufacturer, where we're concerned about specific characteristics or a description of that particular item.
And I've used this in conjunction with proprietary. So I might say basis of design and then list these characteristics. And one of the reasons that I would do that is if we are allowing other products. So we have two or three manufacturers listed, but we get another one, or if we're using a basis of design and these particular characteristics describe that basis of design, when I look at the comparison on the product data sheet with the other product that the contractor might want to use, then I don't have to pull up the product data sheet again. And this is also really important for the young professionals in your office, both from the architectural and the construction, the contractors that are putting these submittals together, to have this type of description so that the young professionals can get used to seeing a description of what these materials are and then being able to associate the names to it when they're doing the submittals. So that's how I've seen it with the descriptive. And we'll see this also similar for reference standards. I'll use, ASTM C1316 in this example. I'll use that and then continue to describe the characteristics that I want from those standards so that if I'm, looking at a substitution or just reviewing a submittal, then I know what I'm looking for in the submittal before I approve it.
So there's another, the reference standard is one of my favorite reference standards to use has to do with, excuse me, with finishing this, the AMA 2603, 2604, and 2605. You can actually, for example, you can actually meet the finish requirements for AMA 2605 with either a liquid or a dry system, so you can use and those those are physically different things, but the end result is I want it to meet the performance, long-term performance characteristics that are defined by ASTM, AMA 2605, for example.
Yeah, that's a great example, Eric. Thanks for bringing that up. Um, Type of funding can really impact your specifications. Do you want to talk about this a little bit, Eric?
Yeah, I think navigating the implications of your project funding, has something what
Right.
that has on material selection and additional specifications, you know, it needs to support the type of projects that are based on that. So, for example, if you're doing a multifamily project and it's funded by HUD, then you've got additional criteria that are associated with Davis-Bacon wages and you've got additional reviews that HUD does, and you have to have three products and there aren't substitutions allowed. And so that's one example. The other one that I've seen is federal funding programs like New Starts for Transit. They've got criteria for funding that, and that has its own set of criteria outside of this. There are other projects for maybe General Services Administration that may include different variations of the Buy America and the Buy American Act. And you'll see in the project notes, we should probably give them that reference, Sherry, for the difference between those two. There's a real good short slide on that I think we may want to share as a follow-up.
Okay.
And that usually includes a minimum number of manufacturers. And manufacturer limitations.
So as we've applied through this conversation on public funding projects, we need competition, right? So that puts us into the design bid build or the design build, but certainly full length, three-part specifications is in order for these types of public funded projects. And private funding is just that, right? It's just privately funded projects. There's no restriction on your selection of your contractor or the products or procurement of products. An example to bring that back would be the owner builder project delivery that we talked about would be a great example of that.
Market rate housing is probably the most predominant example that I've seen that's funded with private equity, either in the form of a developer that's representing a landowner, or you've got a developer that has their own investment partners that they need to execute that project.
Sure. Let's talk about drawing coordination. So, another thing that can shrink or grow your specifications is taking into account, how much information do you want to include on the drawings versus how much can you include in the specification?
Yeah, so say it once is we probably didn't have can't have that big enough on the screen. It's a great way to remember that we need to specify a level of detail uh, that may or may not be included on the drawings, and consider this example here of a fire extinguisher cabinet. There's a lot of design decisions that go into that, but take into account the most logical place to put those details, put that information. And sometimes it's either easier or it's simpler to include that in the spec and include that in the drawings. But be consistent, I think, throughout your project documentation.
Yeah, and I think getting it selected before it goes out to bid can alleviate some issues after the fact, right? I was just talking to someone who said that they worked with an independent specifier, and if they didn't know the answer, they just said as selected by architect. And then during the construction process, they were getting all of these RFIs about, well, what do you want for this? What do you want for that? It says as selected by architect. What do you want? And it created some havoc. So I'll push for resolving questions prior to bidding and look at all the questions that pertain just to fire extinguisher cabinets that are up here. Fire extinguisher cabinets are often overlooked until, the last minute detail on your drawings. And we can decide, do you want to include all this on the drawings or do you want to put it in the spec? Or do you want to answer it after bidding as part of an RFI? So resolving it earlier has its benefits as well. This example is cross-referencing for wall covering. Oftentimes we'll get a finish schedule that has all this information on it. So is it necessary to repeat all that information in the specification? I vote no, and I refer back to that finish schedule on the drawings or whatever section it's in. One of my clients puts it in Division 9. So refer back to that so you're not repeating things. Of course, the benefit to doing that is that if something changes, you only have to change it once. If the interior designer decides that they want to change WC14 to something else, they don't have to let me know so that I have to go through and change it in the spec. So that's a big benefit also is saying it once, again, say it once in the most logical place. And so you reduce errors in coordinating.
Yeah, I think that becomes more important for independent specifiers to give the design team the power to change that without, you know, forcing something into the spec that then they have to go somewhere, go back to the spec to change that. They have the power as a design team to answer those questions during the next phase. I think wall covering is a great example, though, of something that is specified in one place but does impact a different section because it requires a level 5 drywall finish, to get a good substrate for that wall covering. So you get something in one paragraph, one section that does affect another section.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so drawing and spec coordination, we can talk about, usage terms or product descriptions. We can be generic or we can be proprietary. And so, putting those proprietary descriptions on the drawings, might reduce the amount of information included in the spec. But you really just got to decide on something and sort of run with it. So if you're going to call it an air and weather barrier in one place, but then call it Tyvek in another part of the drawing, then you're starting to sort of blur the lines between those two.
Yeah, absolutely. If once your method is determined, just be consistent and do it everywhere. I think if you've listened to my training sessions before, I use consistency quite a bit in that respect. Is um, just choose a line and follow it. Don't make it an Easter egg hunt. Don't decide that you want the contractor to look for one thing on the spec and one thing on the drawings. And decide how much quality control you want over those decisions. Not only as from a installation point of view or product selection, but do you want submittals on the products? Do you need a mock-up? And if you're not going to include that in the spec, if you're going to use proprietary, on the drawings, how are you going to convey what you want from that product elsewhere in the project? So navigating specifications, now that we've talked about all these different things, let's roll everything into how this applies to, putting it together in the specification to identify information that you might not need or you might really want.
Related sections is a hot take if you're gonna really get into it. So opinions on the usefulness, appropriateness, benefits, and even pitfalls can vary wildly, and people can go pretty hard on this one way or the other. I have used these historically to cover scope where I felt or someone has felt like the contractors breaking apart the specifications and sending limited information to subcontractors.
Yeah, I've heard problems too about how what's not listed there, like look at that. There's 12 on the related sections over there, and they're like, well, but what's WSO1 or whatever? It wasn't listed, and so that's no longer part of my scope, or it gets a little crazy when particularly when you're competitive bidding, right? Because you don't have that relationship with the contractor. And so they're working with, what you're giving them, and they're probably low bid maybe. And so they're looking for every way out. So this is a great spot for them to dive in and see if they can get some extra dollars and come up with an excuse for not putting the waterproofing under the tile or whatever. References. I admit that I don't use these. because I'm gonna make the references within the document. I don't expect the contractor to have these on site. I do think it's nice if you can read the entire standard, what is that testing method? What does it say? We're not going to tell them what it is, but we're going to give them the reference. I feel like it takes up a lot of space. Can take up a half a tree maybe, but that's probably not a good reason not to use it. I just haven't found the usefulness in stating the entire testing standard out. But I'm going to let Eric weigh in on this because I know that he does use these.
Yeah, so the I think most people that know me know that I'm a fan of SpecLink, and I do use that, the software does have a provision in there that sort of automates part of this process that can really help you not include those list of references that aren't in there. Um, there are use cases, I think, for including this and not including this. One of the one of the pet peeves of mine is the date at when someone does this and they list the date, that may or may not be the current active standard. I've reviewed a lot of reviewed a lot of specifications where it would list ASTM-C 209 dash 97, and nobody needs to be using a standard that's dated in 1997. So the software I use solves that problem by turning off the date um, uh, at the end of the standard. So that's one way that I use it. Submittals. So this is one of my favorite topics, actually. So do you actually need them? Which ones do you want? What do you want to learn or control as part of those submittals? But the big question here is, you know, what do your design team want? What does your client want? What does your team want and need? And do you have in your scope the capability to review all the content all the submittals that you're asking for?
Sure. And I had an experience with a client many years ago. Um, they didn't want to see submittals unless the contractor was going to use something that they didn't select. And I thought that was a pretty great approach, really. It was a relationship. It was the relationship between the architect and the owner and the architect and the contractor that they were able to say, if you're going to give me what I asked for, why are you giving me a submittal? I don't need to see that. And there were some projects where they would actually list out, well, we do want to have a mock-up of this, or we do want this particular submittal for this reason. But they were um, very clear about what they were asking for and why they wanted to see it. And I think it really streamlined the whole construction process and the submittals. For qualifications, that goes right back to the submittals is if you're asking for qualifications for your manufacturer and your applicator, you can get a submittal on that because you're asking for proof of or certification of how many years they've got and what do they have experience on 3 projects of similar size and scope in the last 5 years. So that's going to weigh into your submittals. That's going to add on to your submittal load too. But if you're in a design build or a negotiated or an owner builder um, type of contract, the contractor presumably already has a relationship with the manufacturer and or the installers. So that we're not going to be asking them for this level of documentation. But if you don't have that, that's when you're going to see, this is the public bid stuff. If you don't have those relationships, this level of detail is either going to help limit competition, but also maintain that quality control for the project.
Yeah, and some of the keys here is that I think coordinating this list of qualifications with the manufacturer's list or the basis of design becomes critical. So if you know your basis of design is three companies that have been around for 30 years, um, do you need that 20 years of documented experience from the manufacturers? Well, then that probably plays into whether or not or how you're allowing substitution provisions to come in. If someone is allowed to do substitutions and you want that, then maybe those manufacturer qualifications are relevant relative to those substitutions. But if you've got a closed proprietary spec and you want those, or you got to, if you're going to allow substitutions and it's a list of three manufacturers that allow for substitutions, then maybe that's an appropriate qualification. But I've seen a lot more emphasis on the applicator or the installer's qualifications. Yeah, and so when we get to specifying by, material properties, this can be used sort of as a performance spec, but it can limit competition, and that could be either that could be either intentionally or unintentionally. Um, ASTM, remember the ASTM testing standards, should be the minimum acceptable versus what the manufacturer tested results are in order for you to get an apples to apples comparison. Because if you're going to say, well, let's use the water vapor permeability is, it's 0.3 perms, but if the ASTM allows something slightly different, then what are your real goals, and have you created a conflict there?
Yeah, and this is going to go back to my comment previously about getting young professionals familiar with the products. When you're listing out your material properties, it reduces that extra time to go grab your product data sheet on the product that you specified around to make sure that we've got apples to apples comparison. And manufacturers listings, this is going to be back to the proprietary specifying, consider what is acceptable for your project. If you list your three manufacturers are equal, you probably want to describe the properties you're looking for from the product in case you do get that substitution. Whereas if you have your basis of design and you can refer to your your finish list is going to have all those material characteristics included.
Yeah, and if as soon as you start talking about what your no substitution clauses are, I think what's important is defining those and understanding what those clauses mean and having a good reason for that. So I think that's really, if you're gonna do this in the case that's presented, like you probably shouldn't show both B and C in this case. So pick a horse, and go with it.
For execution, I guess the conversation is when can you just say install in accordance with manufacturer's instructions? When we're really leaning into describing in so much detail, when do we get too far into describing means and methods and crossing that line to means and methods? And not all manufacturers may have the same recommended installation methods. One specifier shared with me recently that they feel that they looked at this, I think it was a window. They looked at this window manufacturer, the installation instructions, and they just didn't feel like it was detailed enough. And so they added a bunch more rigorous requirements. So I guess in summary, I just want to say, be cautious about over specifying installation so you don't run into that accusation of specifying means and methods, but don't be so light on them that you're leaving yourself open to risk or poor installation.
That's an awesome point to drive home, Sherry. The little nuance that I've always looked for, and this is based on, it'll make sense when I say it. There's a little nuance between install in accordance with manufacturer's instructions versus manufacturer's written instructions. So, having someone out in the field, waving their finger and pointing something and saying something, you know, could create some sort of conflict. So, I like to emphasize the written or the printed instructions when I do ask for those.
It's a good idea.
Yeah, field testing is something that really requires a level of coordination. I think not everybody sort of appreciates or pays enough attention to. So it really comes down to what obligations are you setting and what expectations do you have for field testing, but also what costs are your owner going to incur when you do put that field testing in it? Do they have that in their budget? And so that becomes for me a great place to engage the owner during the design phase so that it's not a surprise at bid time where they wonder, why are my why are my window bids, through the roof.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and then schedules, there are numerous use cases for submittals. I think that you got a couple of them here on the screen. But in the glazing example, that's a place where we can elaborate on different types of glazing that go into a summary outside the technical requirements and that are in the body of the spec. And then also have a way to facilitate coordination with the design team and make a clear case for where those glazing types live.
Great. So this might feel like a lot of pieces to consider when you're editing the specification, but really the two components that it comes down to is your bidding requirements and your relationships. So I hope what we talked about today has helped you understand, how to use that level of detail in your specification to either drive or limit your competition. Also, by being proactive in selecting the materials in advance and editing the specs to relate, so that the specs reflect the decisions that you've made. Um, that can help reduce the number of questions once construction is underway.
Yeah, so thanks again for joining us today. This was a lot of fun. We do have some additional time, and we would like to open it now for further discussion and questions.
Do we have anything in the chat?
Um, someone was looking for closed captioning. That's the
Uh,
question. Let's see.
sorry. I will include closed caption in the recording.
I got that.
Um, Eric, this would be a good one. You touched on delegated design. Can you give some more delegated design with real life examples and how it impacts the specification process?
Yeah, so cold form metal framing is probably the biggest example of delegated design, and engineers a lot of times don't. From what I've seen, the structural engineer don't want to touch that because it gets to a level of detail of picking and doing calculations for not just the size of the stud, but the gauge and where the return is, and cutting holes in it. And so that that's a level of detail that I think sometimes can not scare engineers, but they don't want the responsibility, and then the contractor is going to be doing stuff in the field, and it's their engineers, so that's probably the biggest one. But defining those things that do get delegated design, sprinklers is easily it's a delegated design that's written based on a performance spec. That's probably the most common example that I see.
Mm-hmm. I've also seen metal stairs. It, it just came to me a couple projects ago where the um, contractor was asked to design the metal stairs. And so I think what I did initially is I took everything out, and then the structural engineer was like, no, 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 you can't take everything out. You still need to give them performance requirements. So I think how that would affect your specification process is you might take out those particulars about, the maybe it's the treads, maybe it doesn't have to be a concrete filled metal pan stair, but it does, regardless of the type of stair, it still needs to meet those performance requirements. So
Right.
that's why you need to include those in the
Yep.
in the spec.
Agree with you 1,000%.
Yeah. I don't see any other questions. And we're almost out of time anyway, but feel free to reach out to either one of us anytime you do have questions. We'd love to hear from you, of course. And again, appreciate your time joining us today, and we'll send a recording with those closed captions on it. Sorry, Lisa, I didn't see that before. We'll stay on until everybody chimes out, but
Thanks
uh,
for having me today, Sherry. This was fun.
yeah, thank you for joining us. I think it was a great conversation. And as
Absolutely.
people are diving off, the last few that stay on are going to find out we're doing this again in Cleveland. And we're really looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
So I need to figure out how to stop the recording. There it is.